Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So as we're getting everything set up, you know, one of the big things I like saying is who I am. So this is another good picture of me back in the day. So I'm an AWS senior security consultant, so I help people move safely and securely things into the cloud. Born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. Somehow I went to the Navy. I don't know how, being landlocked. And so I was in charge of red teaming, breaking into ships, submarines, that kind of fun stuff. It was a lot of great stuff doing that. DEF CON Goon, so I do run speaker ops, so I can understand all the trouble that we have here. Man, it just always happens that way, right? Especially if you do speaker stuff. And then I also went to Harvard because they sent me. And I bring all this up. It's because I'm like a straight C student out of Millard. Shows how good the education here is in Omaha at the end of the day. And then I also have the jam going on right now. So if you're doing the CTF right now and you get really sad because at 4 o'clock they're shutting it down, you can still do this until Sunday. I can't put the code up right now, but they're on the doors out there. So feel free to go get some AWS cloud experience. And some of these exercises I'm talking about, you can start thinking about those things as you're going through these. Now, I want to make sure I know everyone here knows what we're covering, right? I'm not really covering very in-depth things. I'm really trying to stay more thought frameworks. I'm not trying to sell anything or trying to get you to come over to AWS. It's a great platform, but we're trying to be cloud agnostic here, right? We're really trying to think about instant response across all the different cloud providers. And this is really going to be a cloud focus. So when we start thinking about legacy items, that's not exactly the same. There's some unique things to really think about with the cloud. And that's why we have this talk in particular. So again, and I can't cover the perfect IR program. A big thing for me is thinking around how instant response programs are really tailored to each and individual companies, right, at the end of the day. One person's threat model is not another person's threat model. And if you start recommending those things to different people spend lots of time coming up with stuff that is not important, working on things that do not drive value at the end of the day. So we can't cover that. Can't cover some kind of silver bullet for 0 days. I don't have it. And won't be able to cover an hour anyway. And I'm not going to be able to help you be a tailored program, right? This is why all of us are here, why we're spending an entire weekend learning about this type of stuff, is because it's really hard. And so that's why we want to spend some time thinking about it. And lastly, this is also not a sales pitch, right, at the end of the day. If you want a sales pitch, I can hook you up. So here's a quick agenda of what we're trying to cover. So when you're thinking through an instant response program, let's think about some prep work, some of those challenges with instant response, some things around time to respond. Then we want to talk a little bit about some threat modeling and things to think about along those lines. And finally, we want to start covering, well, what are some use cases we can start thinking about, and especially ones that we see very commonly that we can all kind of relate to, especially in today's environment. So let's start off with the prep work. And so with all the good punk stuff, we start putting some safety pins in. We start getting ready to go on out, right? So So some of the challenges to instant response is there's a lot of problems with inadequate threat detection and instant response skills. Probably the biggest thing, especially in the cloud, is there's always a new service being done a brand new way. There's new things coming out, like Bracket with quantum computing is coming out new. How do we secure that? What kind of threat vectors will that open up? There's a large push for call center as a service, which is very, very unique. Well, what additional things can we think about? Are we going back to phone phreaking that we saw in the past? I'm kind of excited if we could get to do that. But we need to kind of think about how all these new services are coming online and whether to be really good at understanding those unique threat vectors and quick on learning them. There's also obviously a skill gap. We all get told all the time, it's all over the news, there's a skill gap. It's hard to find people who are trained, people who are good at these things. So, that's a challenge with instant response. Another area is difficult with alerting, where we run into lots of issues where there's tons of false positives. We have a new thing that comes in, and suddenly you're flooded with all these things for like a cross-site scripting vulnerability, which you can't replicate because of and it turns out not to be a non-issue, but you still have to run through the alerts and different things like that. That gets very tiring as an incident responder. I know that from the past. And I'm sure you feel that as well. There's also the good old-fashioned alert fatigue that this feeds into. So it gets really difficult sometimes to create a robust alerting mechanism at the end of the day that can withhold, especially when new things are coming online and new areas are coming online. And then finally, there's a lot of treating a service as a silver bullet. So we all like a lot of automation. Automation is really big in the cloud environment. A lot of people talk about that. Problem is, what happens when you automate the wrong things? You've just sped everything up in the wrong direction. So suddenly that vulnerability that would have been in one area, suddenly it's put across a wide range of services and different things. So we have to just kind of be aware of that at the end of the day. And then there's a lot of thought around, hey, we have all these technical solutions, but they don't really solve some of these soft problems at the end of the day. Like a lot of the privilege escalation. If you're using the wrong keys, if you're still using root keys, those types of things, that is less of a technical problem and more of like a soft skill problem of understanding processes and procedures in the business. So we have all these kind of challenges with incident response across the board. And then we have lots of common security considerations, right? And so I kind of just leave this up as a lot of just the things that are almost like a checklist, right? So kind of like in the back of your head, these are all the things you can really start thinking about in all the different ways you can start thinking about, oh, how do I have to think about my compute? How do I think about my authentication? How do I think about the compliance needs for my business at the end of the day? And so I kind of leave that more up as we don't want to go through all these because it's a nice chart, but really kind of think about there's lots of stuff. And this is as wordy as it is still very anemic compared to some of the audits I've gone through, some of the things that people have said, where you have pages upon pages of different compliance standards and things along those lines. Just look at the NIST framework, for example. You run into lots of these different things. So another important consideration, which it should be easy to agree upon, is speed really matters at the end of the day. It is important in incident response to move fast. That's probably one of the most important things. Besides, also don't break stuff. Don't break additional things and move really fast. Time really matters when you're responding to an incident. So when we start walking through some of the things, start thinking about, hey, how can I speed up what I'm doing when I'm in the incident? Because that time is very different, and there's a little distortion on how important that time is versus time not in an incident. Two different sides, right? So one of the important things is also to really think about who owns all the different resources. And there's lots of different ways to try to think about this with the different cloud services. One of the ways you can do this is go back, good old-fashioned tagging, right? So you can say, hey, this is owned by application A, this is owned by application B. And that's one way to go back and do that. Sometimes it can be painful, but is extremely important, especially as an incident responder coming into an environment and where you have an alert or something, and starting off and saying, okay, well, this thing belongs here. This thing belongs here, and walking through that. Another way segmentation does happen besides tagging, because not all things can be tagged in all environments, is that having different accounts, right? There are different ways you can do that as well, and that's another very valid strategy. So organization A has account A, organization B has account B, right? So that works as well. What we see a lot of times is an Excel sheet ownership, right? Or a CMDB, where you have, hey, this is the name of the resource, and in column B on this Excel sheet that is on someone's, probably the intern's laptop, we have exactly how everything can map out. So during an incident, it's nice to have the first two in particular set up for you, because the third one is usually the intern is out doing what interns do, right, at the end of the day. And that's not an incident response program. The other thing to think about is what is in these. So it also really matters. Are you talking about PII and PCI data? Are you talking about healthcare data? Or are you talking about new stuff that you're putting up publicly anyway, right? So trying to think about through these things and understanding what types of what is being exposed and what are in these different things is very helpful at the end of the day for a responder to know. And also what kind of exposure, what kind of risk is going to happen with that. If you will have a breach of contract with another business, that is something that's important to perhaps label or figure out how to notate somehow in your environment. Also, it matters prod and dev, obviously, as well, right? We care a lot more about what is happening with prod as opposed to what we have in for our test data. And what very unique thing though, because so far a lot of it's like the physical side, is the responsibility model. So all cloud providers have a responsibility model that says, you are in charge of this, I'm in charge of this as a cloud provider, right? And so it's really, really important to understand where that delineation occurs, right? So that you're not trying to set up use cases and prevent things that's outside of your scope. And more importantly, to make sure that what is inside you understand what's inside your scope so that you're not missing something, thinking that the cloud provider will take care of it for you, right? You can miss out on a lot of very interesting things at that point. And probably the most important thing of doing all that is also making sure you have the contact information set up so that if the cloud provider, something happens in the cloud provider's area of responsibility, they're able to get a hold of you. I have seen several times where there's like an email or a phone number or something that's provided and someone just filled it out. And so when the cloud provider saw something interesting, unique, unusual, they sent an email out. They gave a call and no one picked up for months at a time. So this is another thing. Just be aware of how the cloud provider will contact you if they see something weird as well when you're thinking about that responsibility model. Next thing I really like talking about as well is kind of more of a thought experiment. As you're starting to work through and say, for an incident, you have a certain amount of work. We can say this is hours, this is going to be whatever metric you want, but just as a thought experiment, we'll go with work is that much work. When you go and you take care of something and you have responders go and let's say they're, okay, well, you know what, the CMDB was not updated. So now I have to go find out who's the owner. I have to go chase this. I have to go do that. The eventual effort at the end of the day would perhaps be above the work, which of course leads to what's that delta? That's that wasted amount of time that you can think about, right? Where you have something that if everything else would have been set up right, if the prep work would have been done, you wouldn't have lost that extremely valuable time or effort during an incident at the end of the day. And so the goal would be, okay, well, figure out ways, hey, how can we reduce that effort, right? How can we make that closer, better, and everything along those? A lot of those are kind of what we talked about before. We're thinking about the cloud responsibility model, thinking about making sure people don't have to chase down that extra little bit of data that you need to know. But another huge area is also trying to think of, hey, how can I do some additional playbooks and automation at the end of the day, which helps add into that. So that suddenly you don't have to, the real effort is just that, the little part where the playbook and automation is stuff that's already done for you at the end of the day. So you might still have the same amount of waste, but you know, that's where the playbooks and that automation really help you at the end of the day, because then you don't have to spend that as much effort. And I know the first thing people say, okay, yeah, that's great, James, but there's that playbook and automation takes time at the end of the day, which is a very valid point. But I'm a lazy person. I like to think a lot of people like to think about being lazy. I don't want to do something 2 or 3 or 4 or 12 times. If I have a sweet new script that I come up with on the fly, I want to be able to reuse that again and again. Because then suddenly we have, okay, well, we have that much amount of prep work, right? And then if I do it 5 or 6 times, that's great, right? I end up saving time, right? So that's the obvious answer at the end of the day. Obvious way to talk about ROI with your bosses and executive, like why I need to go back and spend that extra amount of time of understanding an environment, why I need to spend the extra time of tagging those resources. So we don't have to worry about that time. So we don't have to think about updating those things in the heat of the moment. But the other really important thing kind of goes back to my talk about time dilation and time matters differently. So if IRs is the crisis mode, it's usually worth investing 2 hours to save 5 minutes in crisis mode. Just my opinion. You might view it differently. But it's good to think about this. Like, how much time would you invest outside so that you can save that little extra bit of time during an incident? Make yourself go faster during the incident. And as you sit and you contemplate that thing, I think the most important part of this, I go back to Henry Rollins. This is going to go very philosophical, but there's no such thing as spare time, right? No such thing as free time. There's only time. So the biggest part here at the end of the day, and my biggest thing, especially as a father with 3 kids, that wasted time, that's no longer about just time on falling off. It's because usually these crises don't occur during working hours. They occur at 5 o'clock on Friday. They occur on the weekend. They occur some other time. So that's time where you could miss spending time with your loved ones, that you can miss spending time with your kids. That is soul points. You don't want to lose those. You can prep all you want during your working hours and things along those lines so that you can save your soul points at the end of the day. So that's why I really like, besides the fact that I really like his music, that's why I really like this quote at the end of the day, right? Because that, and a huge part of why I think that little bit of prep work and thinking through that is so valuable. So let's talk about threat modeling really quickly and some other things. So at a very high level, again, we kind of talked about, hey, we would get ideas of what we are protecting, but what are we really trying to protect at the end of the day? Like, really think back to the why someone is at the company that you're working at. Why do people value that information? And who wants to get that stuff? Why do they want to get into your environment? No one really wants to go back and hack into, I don't know, a newspaper and steal the articles that are already put online. That's silly, right? Because that's already freely available. But maybe they want to go in and they want to inject something because of propaganda reasons. Or maybe they want to go in and they want to find ways to get compute resources or something out. So think about what the threats want at the end of the day. And then what information you need at the end of the day to find those things, right? So that kind of goes into, and I'm going to ruin a book, but threat intelligence is about adversaries used to make a decision. There's lots of threat intelligence out there, but if you're not using it to make a decision, there is absolutely no value. No value, right, at the end of the day. Now, this is probably worth that entire book. I'll tell you that because the author's a little weird. But if you cannot, I think that's the biggest thing that keeps popping up. Because if you don't need to know that the adversary is going after oil and gas, but you're someone else, then you're not going to make a decision. If you know that they try to do something a certain way, but you have no way to detect it, no way to block it, no way to look at it, why worry about it? That's just creating more alert times, more alert fatigue, and different things that you won't be able to fix. The other big thing to think about is targeted attacks look very different than untargeted attacks at the end of the day, right? So if someone is directly going after your business, it's going to be very difficult to automate some of these things and automate these indicators of compromise because they're going to be able to change them quickly. They're not going to be something you can get from like an ISAC report or something along those lines, right? So it'll be very difficult to think about that. So if you do move everything to this complete automation and you don't think in a very broad context, you might miss those targeted attacks. That being said, if you're not targeted, that might be okay. Some of the value, though, is in looking at those untargeted attacks because these are like fairly easy to automate against. Like it is, when you see some of the things like calling back to like like ransomware or Bitcoin mining or something along those lines, it would be easy to see, oh, hey, my network is pinging back to a Bitcoin site. Oh, my network is reaching back to a known bad place. That's where you can use some of that intelligence in that untargeted area, right? So how I like looking at it is through the good old-fashioned NIST response cycle. So a lot of you probably are aware of it, know it, so I'll just go really quickly from good old-fashioned left to right. So really, for identity, we're determining the organization's critical functions. What's really important for you? And then we're walking into protect for making sure you have these relevant safeguards to protect those critical assets that you have identified, that you want to detect and have some mechanisms to detect bad stuff going on. You want to respond to it, and then you want to recover from it. Normally, this is in a nice, pretty little circle. I like it as a line, as you'll see why I like putting in additional things on it. But this is like a continuous process. And this forks a lot. So you might be halfway through it and realize, oh no, during respond, I detected something new, something more interesting that I have to identify a different resource with. And suddenly it starts kind of branching out, if you will. The other thing to think about is good old-fashioned defense in depth. So you should know this. I'm going to skip all of that, except for the fact, really understand where your responsibility starts. I'm going to hit that again, because in cloud, if you're using different services, you have to be aware of, again, where you need to protect yourself, right? If you're using a compute resource which is using a server, then you have to protect the endpoint. If you're using serverless, you don't have to protect that endpoint the same way. If you're using APIs, it's different. So again, that's where the defense in depth will really change for you, especially as you're thinking about incident response in the cloud. And then also, I've always found it good, also try not to mix responsibilities. If you have lots of serverless stuff, and it's doing something very similar to your like compute resources that are like EC2s versus like Lambdas or something along those lines, it gets really confusing sometimes of where those responsibilities fall. So I usually like segmenting them out as best as you can to just make it easier on yourself and easier on responders at the end of the day, and advocate for that with your developers and your infrastructure team. So let's quickly talk through a maturity model. So phase one, no playbook. We're doing it live. Like, we're just going with it. This is, sometimes you have to do it because there's something brand new that you've never seen before or it looks just super weird. Kind of the next phase, though, is good old-fashioned classical playbook. I like playbooks. It's really nice to go through, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. One of the key things to think about, like we talked about earlier, you have to be careful with these because you don't want to spend too much time on things that you might not see, looking for threats you might not be worried about at the end of the day. The other big problem with them, they kind of get dated. Slowly they fall out of date. And then sometimes these are done in a silo, right? And so I missed the last talk, unfortunately, but you know, I like this, everything is code now. So we were talking about infrastructure and code and everything. I like Pac-Man now. So playbooks is code, right? So you can do some of the same things you've seen before, where you have like a design chain, you have different people with responsibility. You don't put these playbooks to quote unquote production without other people taking a look at it, other people saying, hey, this works or this doesn't work. So if we go with this idea of, hey, it's cool to have this little Pac-Man guy, right? What does this mean? Really, what it will help do is create a faster mean time to resolve. You're able to have some of those ROIs, get some data-driven incident response. And then you can take some of those like version control things. So as you change things, if I'm going to keep picking on our intern, and I really shouldn't, but if Joe the intern decides to accidentally delete your playbook, you have an old version that might not be up to date. And then you can, I think the best thing though is if you have the response playbook, and if you work in your developers, if you work in your architecture folks, where they have to approve like, yeah, that's exactly what we would be doing during an incident response to recover, then you get that updated at the end of the day. You get that team integration where you're actually talking to them, and so you're not doing this in a silo. And that helps you make what I like calling is security deputy. So in cloud, when I've been helping out customers, one of the things I keep seeing, there's always that one person who's like your biggest ally. He's like the deputy, so like on any kind of like cop show, he's the random local cop that shows up and helps you like solve the mystery because they understand the local systems, they understand the local resources. So it's always fun to find that security deputy to get them involved in your playbooks. Because you might have a very different playbook, and I bet you will, between like application A and application B at the end of the day. And so when you're thinking through that way, playbook as code really kind of helps out across that board. Which leads into, well, James, do you have some examples? And yeah, they actually have some pretty good examples on AWS. So this is the last time I'm going to explicitly state this one. But if you go in, it's on GitHub, it's free, so you can take a look at it, and then adopt it to yourself. This is in Markdown. I've also seen it done with Jupyter notebooks, which is really cool because you're able to just like actually run commands from the Jupyter notebook to do some of the fancy things we'll talk about later, right? So actually do run some like APIs and CDKs to like run different services in the backline, isolate those instances, cut off those different things, start running some of these services. And I can provide the link because I see a bunch of people taking pictures for that. The other big thing is the CI/CD pipeline. Try to get involved with this as well for incident response. Because again, if we're trying to save time later on, if we can get involved with doing some, I know there's also shift left that was being talked about in the last time. Great, love it. We want to do the same thing because I want to catch that earlier as opposed to with my prowler scans or after there's an actual incident or something along those and finding that there's a vulnerability. So in particular, we want to be able to, well, we don't want to deploy on Friday. We do have times where sometimes we have to deploy fast, right? I think some people have worked on the Log4j or worked in the Spring4Shell. Suddenly, we're basically doing a Friday deploy where we're trying to do something really quickly to solve those. So if they have a solid pipeline like this, as soon as those fixes are out, you can push some of this forward, right? So with all that, let's quickly talk through some of the use cases, very, very basic use cases and how you can think about through all these different things. So use case one, the dead milkman and compromised credentials. So in this one, we're talking about, hey, they scan GitHub. It could be internal, external. Maybe it's an internal actor doing it. Who knows? And they find some keys, right? So access keys are really important in the cloud, as I'm sure everyone realizes. It's the main way we authenticate and everything along those lines. And what can happen because they have three kind of avenues I like thinking about. You can find root keys, create additional keys, more keys. Just start making all kinds of accesses for persistence and being able to stick around there. You can go after compute power. It can really matter what kind of compute power you have. If you are doing a lot of machine learning, have a lot of GPUs, maybe they're going to go in and try to up that and try to have you pay for their Bitcoin miner at the end of the day. Or you pay for their password cracking or those different types of things. Or they might have other services. With all the new services coming out, Quantum isn't there yet, but when Quantum gets better, maybe you can actually start cracking some of the some encryption later on as in 3 or 4 years with Quantum stuff. And we might see a new attack vector where people try to get in, try to grab some of those services to crack that. Or maybe they're going to try to get into the call center as a service and dial the 1-900 numbers at the end of the day so that they can generate money for their colleagues overseas or something along those lines. So really think about where that compute power might be helpful. And then your good old-fashioned data, so like PII, credit card numbers, things along those lines, right? They might try to pull that. Or if you're working for government, maybe it's patents and secrets and things along those lines. Or maybe at a university research. These are the good old-fashioned things that people would try to get with their credentials. So having heard that, hey, dead milkman decided to get in, let's start walking through the good old-fashioned NIST, right? So the first thing is, okay, where could identify our key things that they could be doing and our key kind of services. So really thinking about, okay, where are our keys? Are people trying to look at those? Identify those. And then we try to go back, well, how can we protect them? And this is a lot of this stuff happens before the detect. So, and least privilege, right? Make sure developers aren't using root at the end of the day. Make sure they don't have admin or allow across the board. Starting early prevents this from escalating even worse. And then if you find some of those later, if you ever have those controls or they try to do that, it won't work for them. How you can detect it? Good old-fashioned logging. So making sure you have a good logging program in the cloud. There's lots of different ways to do it. Just make sure you're able to see, hey, who's using these access keys, especially the one that was compromised, and be able to look back so you can start tracing through everything. The easiest way to respond, revoke it. You can remove that. And then you can start going back and saying, okay, well, detection, I discovered, hey, they were in compute power, go back, and then you start, this is where that branching occurs. And then recovery, super easy. You just re-give out keys again, right? So now they revoke the keys, you go back and put out the keys, right? Super simple, again, very broadly thinking about how with all the providers, this is going to be the similar process you do. So use case 2. So Black Flag is got into a compute resource. We don't know if they're into the other ones as well at the end of the day. So kind of same method, right? We take a look. What's our really important thing here? We have a compute resource. This might be different for you. So you might have different controls for your heavily GPU-intensive machine learning compute or your EKS clusters with additional things on it, which can scale out crazy numbers, versus some other items, right? Versus the ones that hold additional data. For protection, this is good old-fashioned, lots of defensive depth, and detection, logs, and hopefully you have an endpoint of security of some point. There's lots of different options across the board for endpoint. The other option is, of course, if you are not using something that can take an endpoint, like if you abstract out, as we were talking about, with responsibility, so it's the cloud provider's responsibility for that endpoint. Suddenly, oh, well, I don't have to worry about having a CrowdStrike or a Tanium or something on my endpoint. I can just look at the logs now because that is what it is. And so then you're stuck with, then you're at the respond point, right? And so what we do here, and the most important thing with incident forensics, in this case, we have to cage it. I wish there was a bigger laugh to that because I'm going to go down this joke a long ways, my friends. So as we're going to cage the incident, what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be removing some of the access to internal resources. We're going to remove access to the external resources, so they're not able to communicate out. And then you'd want to have some kind of forensic setup at the end of the day so that you'll be able to connect to them. So figure out what they're talking to, what resources are similar, how it's talking, right? And then being able to take a look at those logs outside and all that. I think the most important thing, especially for the first three, and I probably should have grouped this a little bit better, is that all can be done automated, right? You can have a script to go in and say, boom, 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 as a responder. That's your part of like your infrastructure as code, your incident responses code of doing those first things to cage off that instance, right? And then you can determine additional indicators from some of your other sources, where it's looking at logs that are sent over to Splunk or to something else along those lines. And then you can start really thinking about guessing intent and understanding like, okay, well, what are they looking for? And now that you've contained it, bought yourself a little bit of time, you start saying, okay, well, did this spread to somewhere else? Do I have to cage other things? Did it move into other areas, like maybe this area has privileges where they could create additional credentials or things along those lines, or other kinds of persistence. So it's really important to think about those types of things as you're responding to it. And then finally, after you've gone through and you've figured out and you're able to isolate those instances, it is a lot. You just have to go ahead and deploy and make sure your new deployment is safe and secure. Because you don't want to go back, if you didn't go through and discover why this instance was infected or the problem, and you redeploy, it might just be, hey, the attacker just needs to send over another packet, and they're right back in because they're using Log4j or they're using some SQL injection or something along those lines. So at that point, then you can deploy and recover for that. So use case 3, I'm going to go with the Ramones this time. Is ransomware. Good old ransomware. So we're saying the Ramon somehow gone to this compute instance, started encrypting lots of things. Someone came to us and said, hey, it's all locked down at this point. We did see some things reaching back out into IP out in the cloud, as they do. So if, just in case, so usually what happens with ransomware, as they start encrypting, when they're done, they send out, hey, this is the key, and then make sure if you try to find anything on that instance or that node, it says, hey, give me Bitcoin, and we'll give you your key back, right, at the end of the day. If they're not communicating out, they might not have, there might not be the payoff at the end. It's a really interesting space if you really want to dig deeper into it. But in this case, let's say we actually do see some of it reaching out, right? So again, the most important thing is, what are the critical resources? Here, it's really critical we have a backup, right? Because if we can back up and everything's not encrypted, that's good. And if we don't have backup, I don't really know, usually. Hopefully you can remake the data really easily, because otherwise you're in a world of hurt, or you need to break out that Bitcoin wallet and be paying off some Russians somewhere. So the important part for protect is probably the most important thing here is actually that backup, right, for this use case in particular, right, and understanding how to make sure that can't be deleted. Because the second thing they'll do after they get in and they encrypt some of those items, they'll go after those backups to make sure the backups aren't happening, right, so that there is a loss of data, so there is a threat to your company. For detection, this is going back into some of the detection things that might be unique. you might be able to see, like, in our case, we have like an indicator of it talking out. So we try to say, okay, what are the resources that are talking out, things along those lines. And then as for response, we're caging it. And then for recovery, it's either going to be good old-fashioned paying off the people and getting those keys to decrypt everything, or recovering from backup at the end of the day. So probably with all these use cases, and we're purposely very vague, what I would like you to take away from it is you have your own use cases. So when your executive says, hey, I read this really cool thing on Wired, I want you to do X, Y, Z, then you can start like walking through some of these things for them so that you're able to like show that value, and you're able to like really convince them and think very smartly around these things. And if there are small deviations, you're not going to be spending lots of time trying to come up with how you solve those deviations during crisis time. You're going to be able to solve them during your prep time, right? And be able to save time. And then you'll be able to hopefully have this yearly executive function where they look through some of these use cases, like, yeah, this makes sense. This is great, and update your playbooks and the ways you're doing protection that way. Even better would be like having the good old Pac-Man review. So hopefully your code is nice, going through DevOps and everything is reviewed every time there is a major change to everything. But the coolest thing would be if you can do like procman testing or something along those lines at the end of the day. So like you actually test that you can recover your backups as you're deploying as part of your build line, your process. So we covered a lot of stuff, right? We talked about some of the prep work. We talked about a little bit about threat modeling. Talked about some of the use cases, especially for the cloud at the end of the day. And with that, any questions? Wow, nothing. Yeah?
I'll ask you something, just so you don't feel awkward.
Okay.
So out of those use cases that you gave, which one do you feel you see as most prevalent versus which one do you see as the largest risk?
So the question was, out of the use cases, which one do you think is the most prevalent and which one would have the most risk, right? Good. So I'll switch it a little bit. I think the most important one would probably be the second one, because we're walking through of something that would be used a lot, where there's functionality there that you'd want to use a lot, that the caging, and I'll get away from using that in the future. But those are all things that will be done every single time, right? Isolating an instance is extremely important and will be used in multiple use cases. So finding that functionality is kind of like that little Lego block, that little building block that you'll use often, right? So I think that is the most important one. And that's why I think that one was definitely the most important one. The one that is probably the riskiest, it really depends, again, on the threat model at the end of the day. If I am like a military industrial complex or something along those lines, ransomware can be really bad, right? And fairly simple comparatively, right? Because you could easily create a denial at the worst possible opportunity and things along those lines. That being said, if you're a small business or something along those lines, and you lose root credentials and don't have everything set up properly and don't have the proper contact channels to contact your cloud provider, you can be out of business. And there have been several cases where they were compromised, they lost root keys, and they weren't able to recover their business, and small startups have gone completely out because of that. So sorry for kind of just throwing the question, but that, I think it really does depend on the use case, and that's why it really needs to be tailored. Yeah?
What percentage of customers that you work with are at the automation of IR, like automated IR, like your Pac-Man?
Okay, yeah, gotcha. What percentage of customers that I work with are at the automated using like Procman or Pac-Man and things along those lines? I don't think I can say on stage. So I think it.
High percentage or a low?
I think it's a low percentage. I think people are working more towards it, right? Because I think there's a lot of folks working into the cloud environment. I think I can say, because we have so many issues with like cloud being a brand new environment, and because we have We have a lot of security technical debt trying to just get people up into the area, and we're so in demand, like let alone getting people enough time to work a little bit and to reach some of these things. And getting leaders to understand that is also difficult. So that's why I kind of bring that up, is to think about. I think the other big benefit is you can do some of these things and start sharing them, because a lot of these things are, especially with cloud, a lot of these things are not going to be completely unique to the environment. And if you think about that, that can really help you, because if that's open source, if that's put out there, a lot of this, it's just like names change, but the underlying structure does not change. So as we as a community think about this more, I think we're all going to help each other out more as we start coming up with these like fancy playbooks and things along those lines, and then everyone will use them. All the way in the back.
What are some native AWS tools that you think are underutilized that can make a big impact?
So what are some native AWS tools that are underutilized and could make a huge impact? So I think I'm trying not to put on my business hat, but I mean, a lot of the security services out of the box are really good. I always recommend with customers at the end of the day, try to be something you're familiar with. Probably the hardest thing is training up an incident responder in a new tool. So I could come up here and say, hey, you know what? You should use the Elasticsearch or OpenSearch, and it should be attached to Security Hub and yada, yada, yada. But if you're a Splunk shop, and all your stuff would be going to Splunk anyway, that's a bad recommendation, because then everyone needs to get retrained into using these new security services at the end of the day. Because my big thing is making it more secure. Now, if I have to have like 12 of your folks learn something brand new, that's tough. Unless there's something else that is super compelling about that. Because if it gives you added functionality to do this, because maybe your Splunk license is, I don't know, maybe you're moving away from Splunk, or maybe you're capturing the wrong stuff, or something along those lines, yeah, then that totally makes sense and to use those services. So I want to make that small distinction there of, like, I think the most valuable thing, again, is us and the time, as opposed to the services. I'm a huge component of that, and I think that's the biggest thing. That being said, there's lots of things that I feel are very intuitive. And if not, guess what? There's a jam that we are hosting that helps you see some of the security services and then things to think about. And some of the use cases start jogging your brain as well. Yes, sir.
How much of your response time do you typically find falls into, okay, I'm following a standard playbook and maybe looking for little unique bits, versus going off and, well, this is totally different, and I'm having to do this from scratch and find novel ways to respond to something weird?
Right, so the question is, how much of my time is spent looking into novel, new, and weird stuff versus stuff that is like automated and kind of already there? I say it traditionally has been like 10% is there and 90% is brand new, weird, and whatnot overall, right? I'm wanting to shift that more and more as much as I can with that. And then, so that's a big thing that I advocate for, especially with customers and things along those lines of, okay, well, where can we start grabbing those chunks, right? Because 10%, it sounds so small, like 10% is not much, but moving from 10 to 20%, that's a huge deal. Saving 10% of time is awesome, right? And so it's a small incremental steps all the way through as we're trying to figure out more things to kind of plug in at the end of the day, right? But right now, I really feel like we're at just the beginning cusp of really being able to understand some of these things and really leverage these things, especially as we start thinking about like infrastructures, all the as codes, infrastructure as code, and things along those lines as well. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what are some of the significant techniques that you see companies having a challenge when they move from on-prem to the cloud when it comes down?
Gotcha. What are some significant challenges that come from when companies move from the on-prem into the cloud? So I think the biggest one is the security folks are usually the last ones. Let me move so I can actually see you, are the last ones to actually have time and energy and effort to be able to train up in understanding the cloud environment and different things. It's not that it's hard. It's not. It's the fact that we don't have time as it is on-prem, and we're usually short-staffed and everything to get to that extra step. And that's why I brought up the fact that we usually find that deputy, right? Find that person who understands that business environment. And where we offer something very unique to a lot of developers is we're able to kind of segment out and block out, hey, this is some threat modeling stuff you can think about. Here's some different things that developers don't get as often or they don't usually experience in the day-to-day world. And so we can help them like run the incident, but then utilize them as like for these specifics at the end of the day. So like, hey, it looks like they're going after something. What would they be going after in your SageMaker instance? Like, oh, well, SageMaker has lots of GPUs. Maybe they're going for yada yada. Like, and then you can that's probably the most effective way I've seen people as they're moving in is finding that peer, finding that friend, finding that security deputy to help them out at the end of the day. All right. So with that, I'm going to say one last time, Security Jam is going to be for AWS. It's going to be going all the way till Sunday. So after the CTF, if you've already done all that and you still want some more, or you leave the con and you're like, I could have used some more of that, you can go ahead and take a look at that and do that. It's free. It's fun. And with that, thanks. Appreciate everyone's time today.